We have one small problem left with our photo sharing web application, and that has to do with the security of the API. We've already seen here that we have secured our web pages so that in order to add something to an album or actually create a new album itself, you must log in. But I'd like to take a second and look at what happens if we try to just directly from the API add things. So let's fire up our server here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to execute a put at the API level on the albums collection of a new album called France 2010. Ideally, we would like these puts to fail as well unless you're authenticated with our system. However, we see here it works perfectly fine. The problem is let's look back here on our server. We only have sort of code to do authentication here on the pages, and our API itself is not authenticated. So what I have gone ahead and done is I have written a new function here called require API login. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use this HTTP basic authentication, which we saw late in lesson 7. And basically, what HTTP basic auth works by you give the client a username password, and then it sends a request with a header called authorization basic, and then this glump of data here. Now this is base64 encoded username and password, and they're separated by a colon. So we are going to make our system require an email address and a password, and don't for a second think that this is some form of encrypted data. Base64 encoding is just a way of taking potentially complicated characters and guaranteeing that they fit in very simple ASCII characters in case you're trying to send along any binary or UTF-8 characters that aren't simple ASCII. So what we're going to do here in our require API function is we're first going to be nice, and that is if we detect that you're using this from the web browser, i.e. you have a session, and that you're already logged in, we're not going to make you log in again. So we're just going to say next, go ahead. We're going to write a little middleware function here to do this. However, if you're not in the browser and you're not logged in, then we want to see that authorization header. We'll decrypt that base64, we'll split out the email address and the password, and then we'll send those two things onto a new function we've written on the user handler called authenticate API. Let's take a look at that now. So way at the end of the user manager, the user handler here, I have this new authenticate API, which basically says get the user by email address, which is the one you passed in. Then I do that bcrypt check password, compare that they're right, and then return either an error or a signal that we're happy with it. If we get one that we're happy with, then we just say, great, go on ahead, and they can continue using this API. Otherwise, we're going to call a function here called needAuth. Now, what this function does is it just sends down the standard expected response for a failed basic auth request, and that is we send down a www authenticate header, and we then complain that we want you to authorize. If you failed before, what we're going to do is we're actually going to set a timeout of 5,000 milliseconds or 5 seconds just to sort of prevent you from doing dictionary attacks or constantly trying to guess at what a user's password is. So we've set up the user manager for everything. We've got the extra plumbing here. We've got the middleware require API login component here. So now all we need to do is secure these APIs by saying require API login. And then similarly, this put will also need a require API login like that. Now, hopefully we have everything in place to now require that our APIs are authenticated. So I'm going to restart the server with the new code. And I already have an album called France 2010, so let's call this France 2011 and France Mark II and Part 2, and we'll say we went exactly 1 year later. Now, hopefully, we'll get an authentication required. It should crap out and be very unhappy about it. Now, the cool thing about curl is it's easy to specify basic auth information. I can actually just specify it there. And that, again, is just the email address and the password separated by a colon. And now you'll see that once you've authenticated at the API level, you can continue to execute these requests. So we've sort of fixed the security hole in our application, and we've done it in a way that doesn't interfere with the web users using their version of the application. And with that, we've sort of completed our our introduction to MySQL, and we've completely converted our photo sharing application to the MySQL database back end.